Are we failing our students in the way that they're being taught? This is the Leaders of Transformation podcast. And on this show, we interview difference makers and world changers who are disrupting for good. I'm your host, Nicole Jansen, and our guest today is Dr. Kimberly Berens. She is a scientist-educator and the founder of Fit Learning. She co-created a powerful system of instruction that is based in behavioral science and the technology of teaching, which has transformed the learning abilities of thousands of children worldwide, including those who are struggling, average, gifted, or considered learning disabled. For more than 20 years, her system of instruction has produced 1 year's worth of academic growth in only 40 hours of training. Wow. So we're going to talk about how she does that, and then how, of course, we can take advantage of that and learn to learn ourselves, and then, of course, help our students learn better as well. So we're going to talk about her new book, Blindspots: Why Students Fail and the Science That Can Save Them. We're going to explore common myths about learning, the current state of the education system in America, and the Fit Learning methodology that she has developed that has been proven to raise proficiency levels dramatically. So I'm excited to have her here. Kimberly, welcome to Leaders of Transformation.
Thanks so much. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I was excited to hear what you had to say, because obviously this is a subject, a very popular subject, talking about the educational system being broken. But a real question is, like, what do we do about it? So let's talk about your new book and what inspired you to actually write it.
Right. Well, it's a complicated question. So, I've been doing this work for almost 25 years. I'm coming up on 25 years. And, when you work with kids and families for that long and you see the same recurring issue over and over and over again, there comes a point where you get, there's a little bit of rage and a lot of frustration. And also a lot of heartbreak. I've had, in the intro of my book, I start with a story about an interaction I had with a mom. That, again, I wrote one story in there, one kind of narrative about it, but I've had those same interactions, hundreds and hundreds of times, where you have a mom who's just heartbroken and in tears about how to help her child. For this particular situation, it was reading, but it applies. I've worked with mothers and fathers who were in tears about any academic situation with their kid, and it just creates a feeling of helplessness. And what frustrates me so much is that there's been a science available to educators since the 60s that has never been consistently implemented in our school system, and it's a tragedy. And so, what really evoked me to write the book was that I just felt that it was time to try to communicate this to the public in a way, rather than, I have these one-on-one conversations with lots of parents, but that's one parent, and who tells another parent and tells another parent, and that word of mouth works, but it's slow. And so my mission is to try to create distinctions for parents and educators about why traditional methodologies fail so frequently, and the science that we've known for a long time about how to ensure that those failures actually don't happen. And so that was really, the motivation. It was trying to communicate this to the public in a powerful way, so that, number one, there's an awareness. Knowledge is power. So when you have an awareness about effective science-based practices, then teachers and parents can be better advocates for their students and kids, and also try to get these practices into the school system in a more massive way. So,
yeah, and it was interesting as I was reading it, and you started talking about distinctions in behavior and how we label things. You mentioned a lot about ideology, and that's a whole other podcast we can get into another time. But the thing is, that was very interesting to me is talking about the premise of what's needed in the educational system to have things work. Now, before we do that, I would love to have you talk a little bit about the statistics for those that don't know, or only know it from their own little sphere and not realizing how pervasive it is. Can you talk a little bit about the statistics? And then
Yeah.
even like including with that, like different grade levels, which are struggling more, ethnic groups, which seem to be suffering more than others, and why that
Yeah.
is?
Yes. So, the stats I'm going to talk about are publicly available. Every year, not every year, on testing cycles, our country implements something called the National Assessment of Academic or Educational Progress. And that occurs on cycles, the most recent cycle being 2019. And it's administered with fourth, eighth, and 12th graders in our country as a way of evaluating how our school system is doing. And so those data have consistently shown, and again, it goes back to when the NAEP was first implemented. So this goes back to the early 1970s, which was the first administration of that test, that, more than 60%, if you look at all groups combined, more than 60% of students in the United States are below proficiency in all academic subjects. So that includes mathematics, science, reading. There's even geography and civics included in there. So, that's more of the general kind of global statistic that a majority of students are below proficiency. But then you can kind of look at these with different lenses. So, one kind of horrifying lens is that more than 80% of low income students are below proficiency in math and reading, in all subjects actually, but math and reading are the ones that I find to be the most alarming, because those two skills build on everything. So when you look at socioeconomic status, it's very alarming. And then when you look at children of color, particularly, Black students are below 90% are below proficiency in math and science. And, almost 90% are below proficiency in reading. And unfortunately, as we know in our country, race and class tend to go hand in hand. Race and socioeconomic status tend to be quite linked, unfortunately, in our country. So, that's not surprising, because a lot of children of color also come from low income families. So those statistics are very alarming, because if you think about, kids pulling themselves out of the socioeconomic situations that they're born into, the only way to do that is through education. And when, schools are so dramatically failing kids in those communities, that's a life sentence to have that cycle be repeated with future generations of those kids. And then you can look at, grade level advancement is also quite alarming. So a greater percent of fourth graders score as proficient on the NAEP than eighth graders, and a greater percent of eighth graders score as proficient than 12th graders. So to kind of explain,
so we're actually going behind, getting worse as we get older.
So the longer kids spend in our school system, the less proficient they become in academic areas. And that is really, hard to understand. Well, not for me, but I think for the public, that's an alarming thing to have to digest. Is, wait a minute, the more my kid gets, the less proficient they become. But that actually is the trend, and it's been the trend again for decades. And there again, as we talk more today about kind of what's wrong with educational traditions and what science actually indicates should be happening, that I hope that will make sense as to why that trend is the trend that it is. But that is very alarming.
So, okay, so let's talk about that in terms of and I know there's a lot of myths that you dispel in your book, and these blind spots. That's why your book's called Blind Spot. And so let's talk about that, why that's happening, and what's the premise that is actually the incorrect premise. So the incorrect, and then of course we'll talk about what's the correct premise to be able to raise proficiency. Oh, there was one other thing I wanted to ask you is, where does this standard come from? This proficiency standard, like
right.
Yeah.
So in the National Assessment of Educational Progress, they have a proficiency criterion. And so there's multiple levels inside that test. So like certain scores indicate basic proficiency, basic levels, slightly above basic, proficient, and then advanced. And so those scores are measured in that way, or actually kind of given that ranking based on, a team of experts who evaluate the test and link up the skills that are being assessed at each level and what that relates to with respect to proficiency in that subject area. So so those proficiency levels are determined by the designers of that assessment.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Thank you for that. Just to
I mean, that's an even more, speaking of which, that's even more alarming. So less than 10% of American students score in the advanced level on that assessment, which is pretty horrifying when you think about us being the quote unquote world superpower.
Yeah.
We have very few students who actually achieve advanced levels on that assessment, which, advanced levels on that assessment predict, success in college level courses, actually pursuing the, very difficult careers in math and science, the people that are going to go out and solve all our complicated world problems. We need kids who are experts in content areas, and that expertise is indicated by advanced levels of proficiency, of which very few kids are achieving that in our school system.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's talk about the premise. Correct?
Yes.
The incorrect and then the correct premise.
Right, and this is also a complicated. I did have to write a book on this, but I'll just boil it down to one pretty major thing. So when you understand the history of our education system and where it came from, what was the most largely influential kind of area, I would say, in education was child development. So actually that's a branch of psychology. So, human development or child development. And unfortunately, developmental psychology is largely a theoretical field of psychology. My PhD is in behavior science, and that is a branch of psychology, even though it should actually be we're more related to biology than we are to psychology and the type of science that we are. But there's a lot of branches of psychology, and some are more scientific than others. So, developmental psychology is largely theoretical, and it's based on kind of observing children as they grow and then correlating or grouping kids, according to stages, right? Stages of development. And unfortunately, because of that, the idea that as kids grow physically, they also develop cognitive abilities that enable them to learn certain things or learn more complicated content areas. And unfortunately, that's actually not been empirically validated at all. To be quite honest, it's the opposite is true. So for instance, a lot of people believe that kids read when they're ready. I don't know if you've ever heard that. But, if you've been a parent of a kid who struggled to read in the early primary grades, a lot of you might have heard your teachers say to you, well, they're just not ready to read and they just need to mature more, and then they'll start reading. And that's one of the, most common myths in education, is that somehow children are born with a pre-existing ability to learn to read and do math and do academic skills. And it's the development of their brain over time that then allows that skill to be acquired. And now what we know in the combination of behavior science and neuroscience is that that's actually completely incorrect, because number one, all these things we learn in school are not in our DNA. These skills aren't a part of our biology. These are human inventions. So reading is a human invention. Mathematics is a human invention. We have invented these things as a way of organizing and advancing our world, but they're not part of our biology. Like, I promise you, if you have a child who's born into the wild and is raised by wolves, that child is not, once they come to civilization, going to be able to read just because they're 10 years old. That's ridiculous. And I don't think anyone would ever think that, but somehow you got to think about it logically when you hear people saying to you, oh, your child's not reading because they're just not mature enough yet, which is really weird, because, children learn to read via instruction. Children learn to do math via instruction. Children learn history of the world via instruction. All these things are learned via instruction and not based on our genetic makeup or how we biologically grow as we age. So that's a really detrimental viewpoint that really dictates how schools are designed. So if you can think about how our kids advance to the next grade level year after year, they don't advance to the next grade level because they've achieved true mastery of the prerequisites required to then learn the content in the next grade level. They advance because they turn a year older, right? So
Right.
age dictates how kids are moved along through the grade levels, which is actually completely contradictory to what we know in the science of learning, is that, age doesn't actually make a difference with respect to how well a child performs. What makes a difference is the type of instruction they've received and also the type of repeated reinforced practice of skills they've had, such that those skills are then mastered as a part of their repertoire. And then they can use those skills to learn more difficult things that build on those fundamental skills. And it's interesting because in any other area of human life where people are focusing on producing expertise. So if you think about, athletic training, people who are training high-level athletes, people training musicians, dancers, all these chess players in the world that are world-ranked chess players, all of their coaches know this. They understand the type of repeated, reinforced practice of fundamentals to a level of fluency, which is automaticity, effortlessness. And it's also correlated with neurological permanence of skills, meaning there's a permanent neuropathway and that skill is now a permanent part of that person's repertoire. All these other areas of our world, they understand this. That's how good coaches coach their athletes. That's how good good music teachers teach their students the violin. But somehow it's kind of gone out the window in academic areas, which is absolutely not scientifically valid at all. So the first and foremost problem is that kids are pushed ahead to higher level content before they're ready to actually learn that content, because their fundamental skills are fluent. They're not mastered at all. And so that's why you have those declining trends in our school system, where you have fourth graders better than eighth graders and eighth graders more proficient than 12th graders. Well, that's because kids are getting pushed ahead regardless of their preparedness for that higher level content, which is a big mess. So that's just one of the problems, I will say. It's how our schools are designed in that way.
Yeah, it's kind of funny when you were talking about music or athletics, that would kind of assume that the older we get, the stronger physically that we get, or the better musicians that we become by nature just because of our age, or the more intelligent. And we've all met somebody who's young and wise and somebody who's old and not so wise. So clearly it doesn't relate directly to age. What's interesting is that with all of the facts, and one of the stories, that beginning story in your book, which was so crazy when I was reading it, was you were talking about being in this room with this young boy that had taken your program, and you had the data, and when you presented the data, it was ignored because this child had already been determined to be dyslexic, and it was like a life sentence to say, this is the way he is, and it doesn't matter what your data says, because they've created this label. So talk about that one, because I think there's a lot of parents that get really, and that can relate to this. They get really upset because their child gets labeled with something, and it's really not actually the fault of the teacher or the principal, because they're just doing what they were taught, right? And so, speaking of repetition, they have learned behavior, which they are now continuing on. But talk about that in terms of like where what's the logic behind that?
Right. Well, there's no, I mean, I like, from my perspective, there is no logic behind it, but I can tell you what it entails. So when you, like, first of all, let's step back again and remember the statistics on our proficiency rates in the United States, which are abysmal. So more than half of our kids are not proficient in core academic subjects. Okay, so that's just a general understanding. So then, are we surprised then that a significant percentage of those kids fail, like we shouldn't be surprised that some kids fail more significantly than others. Like some kids struggle more than others. I mean, that's actually the nature of human learning, is highly variable. So those kids that really, really fail and really, really struggle are the ones that tend to get flagged in, by their teacher for neuropsychological testing. Because unfortunately, the first kind of knee-jerk thought we have as a culture is that if my kid isn't moving like every other kid, if my kid isn't normal, and I'm using air quotes, then something must be wrong with them. Something must be wrong with their brain. Something must be wrong inside somewhere. That's the explanation for their difficulties in reading or math or whatever it may be. And so they go through this whole testing process, and then out of that testing process, they are given some type of label. They're given a classification or a diagnosis of some sort. So for you to understand the problem with that practice, and look, it's sometimes it's hard to be in my shoes because I'm taking on a lot of, there's a lot of people that do this. This is a $1 billion industry. There's a lot of psychologists out there that do this kind of testing. And so it's, what I'm saying is kind of pushing the envelope with respect to but I think it's important for people to have distinctions around what those tests really involve. So when you test a child for, when you put a kid through a neuropsychological battery of assessments, what that psychologist is actually observing is behavior. So that kid is performing a series of assessments, and then they receive a score. Like there's some measured score on that assessment. But that score was based on something that kid did in the assessment, whether it be a reading assessment, whether it be some type of attention deficit kind of analysis where they're looking at their tendency to be impulsive, or there's other, but all of that is based on behavior. So it's all based on something the child does in the assessment. And then from that behavior and from those scores, then the psychologist makes an inference. And they're never, that's not what's said, but I'm telling you that that's what is. So that the psychologist makes an inference about why the child scored that way. And the inference the psychologist makes about why the child scored that way typically involves a disorder. So they scored this poorly on this reading assessment because they are dyslexic. But I'm going to tell you right now, that's never been observed. That psychologist never measured dyslexia directly. They never saw dyslexia anywhere. All they saw was that child's behavior with respect to reading material. And then they gave an explanation for that reading behavior based on a disorder of some sort, but that's never been directly measured. And so, when you're trained in the type of science I'm trained in, which is natural science, we based everything on direct observations and repeated observations over time. And so we don't really like to talk about things we can't see, because when you start talking about things that you can't see, then you're kind of making stuff up that you actually don't know is real. And I'll tell you right now, I've been working with kids for 25 years. A large percentage of those kids have had classifications of dyslexia. And I promise you that every single one of those kids with that diagnosis or classification had significant deficits in fundamental reading skills. They could not identify phonics fluently. They hadn't learned to decode words. Actually, they'd actually been trained to guess words, because that's actually a very popular reading teaching method in schools, is to teach kids to look at the first letter and guess the word based on a picture or a context clue. And so a lot of kids get really good at word guessing because they've been taught to guess. I mean, that's the strategy they've been taught. So rather than learning phonics and decoding words according to phonics and phonetics rules, they're taught to guess. And so then as that guessing repertoire, they don't guess correctly and it gets in the way of their reading, then they're diagnosed with dyslexia, but they're doing exactly what they were taught to do, which is guess words. And so my point is that psychologist has no idea why that child performed that poorly on that neuropsychological assessment of reading. They don't know, because that performance was created by that child's history of instruction, right? So, and more often than not, that history was inadequate. They did not have instruction in phonics and decoding. They did not have the opportunity to achieve fluency, which is a measure of mastery that I've talked about before, which is that combination of accuracy and speed that predicts that that child can use that skill for doing more complex things. So I'll tell you, when a child has a reading issue in class and then takes a reading assessment that and performs poorly because they can't read, and then they're classified with dyslexia, that's not an explanation. Like from my background, a lot of people would say, oh, that's why they're not reading well. They're dyslexic. Okay, now we understand. No, we don't. We don't understand anything because that is not an explanation at all. That's a name that's been assigned to the way that child reads. Whereas I've worked with tons of kids who aren't classified with dyslexia, and they have the same reading deficits as kids who do. They don't have fluency in phonics. They've never learned to decode. They haven't learned to fluently, decode and read words. They skip words. They word guess. They have lots of bad habits. Some just get classified with a disability when those bad habits show up, and some don't. But I would say that those aren't explanations at all. We consistently move kids who have dyslexia diagnoses 30 percentile ranks on normed reference reading assessments after 40 hours of training in phonics and phonemic awareness and decoding. And what infuriates me is like this kid I talk about in my book, where we show those outcomes. We say, this kid went from being basically a non-reader to, 40 percentile ranks higher on a reading assessment. And you're going to tell me, oh, well, they've just learned to cope with their disability. It's like they're still wedded to this notion that this child has something wrong with them, rather than there was nothing wrong with that child to begin with at all. That child just had never been properly instructed in the mechanics of reading.
Yeah.
So it does infuriate me,
Wow.
because what it does is it is when you assign those kinds of labels to explain skills deficits, then the people in charge are absolved of responsibility for actually accelerating that child's skills. Because now there's an excuse or a reason, right? Like, oh, well, he can't read because he has dyslexia, or that child can't write because they have dysgraphia, or that child can't do math because they have dyscalculia. Rather than what component math skills have been missed. And now I'm going to design instruction around producing fluency in those component math skills so that child can actually move forward in their proficiency in grade level mathematics, which is the more pragmatic solution. Let's figure out what component skills haven't been mastered, and let's get kids mastering those, rather than assigning some label that's a life sentence and then becomes an excuse, not just to the educator, but to the child themselves. I've had plenty of kids come into FIT who've been told they're dyslexic, and they will literally say, oh, I can't do that because I have dyslexia. Like I can't do phonics. They told me I can't do phonics because I have dyslexia. I'll never learn phonics. And I'm like, well, let's give it a try. I think you might. And they do. But initially their knee jerk is like, I can't do that. I mean, can you imagine living with that your whole life? And and 43 million adults are illiterate in this country. 43 million. So you think all those adults have something wrong with their ability to read? No, those adults they never got effective reading instruction. And it now is a permanent condition for them as adults.
Yeah. I think about sports, and, in
Right.
sports, if a team is failing and they're losing games, they might look at the players and see who the players are. But what they're really going to do is they're going to look at the coach, and they're going to question that coach, and perhaps even fire that coach and bring another coach in, right?
Yes, they will.
To do something a little bit different and teach them differently. And it's amazing how many stories do we have of, a losing team, new coach comes in, gets them going, right. Skills training, repetition is the mother of skill. So they're as long as, of course, it's the right repetition. So they're going to learn a skill. Let's make sure they learn the right ones. But, in seeing how they're turned around. And it's amazing to me, how this system, it's like it's being perpetuated in the opposite direction. And so it's just mind-boggling, which is, again, why I wanted to have you talk about this, because there is a solution. And so, looking at your program, Fit Learning, and how you do it differently, and the premise that you base it on, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So again, my PhD is in behavioral science, and behavioral science is in fact the science of learning, and a lot of people don't understand that. Now, we're not going in and measuring neurology because I don't have access to that, but we have a behavioral measure that is a indication of what's going on neurologically with a learner, and we call that rate of response or count. And rate of response you can think of as count per minute. So for instance, everything we do at Fit Learning, we measure behavior as count per minute. So for instance, 150 words read correctly per minute, or 70 math facts performed correctly per minute, or 30 equations solved per minute. So everything we do is with respect to rate or count per minute. And that is because we know that when you read, first of all, you can only evaluate fluency, which I've mentioned multiple times in this interview. We can only measure fluency as rate of response. So like when you think about how traditional measures in education, at best you're getting accuracy, right? So 100% correct, 90% correct, 80% correct. But accuracy is not a measure that, I mean, percent correct does not stem from the science of learning at all. And we know in our science that that measure does not predict very important outcomes for learners. Number one, neurological permanence or long-term memory. You know, a kid could get 100%, and I'm a mom, this has happened to me multiple times with my kids. They crush a test 100% because they've crammed for it, get 100% correct. 2 weeks later, can't tell me one thing that was on that test, not one, because it's gone. Because we know
I can relate.
right? So in learning science, you can be very correct and still not remember that over periods of time without practicing it. So correctness does not predict neurological permanence. Fluency does. So at that rapid automatic pace, you know, like 70 math facts per minute, it's not 100% correct. It's 70 correct answers provided a minute. It's those kinds of measures that tell us that a skill is now in permanent neuropathway. It's that measure of neurology that we can't get because we're not putting electrodes on kids' brains, but we have rate, we have count per minute that tells us that. And that measure also gives us a measure of attention span. So this is another really important thing to talk about because ADHD diagnoses are through the roof. I am not kidding. I mean, 20% of kids are getting classified as having attention deficit in schools. And what we know in our science is that attention span is actually a byproduct of training. So like, let's take it back to sports. So Tiger Woods, most people know who that is, the big golfer. When his father was coaching him in golf when he was a little kid, his dad did all these drills with him, got him so fluent at stuff. And then he would do things like drop a bunch of golf clubs in his backswing or scream in his backswing or like throw something by his face when he was like, right, like testing that attention span. So what we know in behavioral science is that when kids become fluent, meaning they reach that level of performance that is accurate and fast, their attention span dramatically increases. So they become very resilient and focused because those skills are so proficient. So attention span is another outcome. And then the ability to apply skills in more complicated ways. So again, think about a violinist who's fluent at playing scales, holding the bow, all of those things. Though that person can more easily learn a new complicated piece of music than a person trying to play the violin who doesn't even know how to play scales. So fundamental fluency and fundamental skills produces application of skills to more complex subject matter. So what we do at Fit Learning is number one, we've developed an assessment for 25 years that allows us to look at every single core fundamental skill in reading, mathematics, critical thinking and problem solving, and grammar and written expression. Those are our major domains. So we look at all of the fundamental skills that are essential for mastery of that subject. So for instance, reading, it would be letter names, like consonant sounds, vowel sounds, decoding words according to phonetic rules, and so forth. We are able to evaluate those in separate assessment periods according to rate, right? So count per minute. And then we can see, okay, what is their fluency on this fundamental skill compared to where it should be? And then we design very explicit, effective practice opportunities designed to build fluency in those areas. And because we've done that for all these years, we produce 1 to 2 grade levels of growth in 40 hours of training. Because why? Not because we have an 8th grader who's struggling in math and we go in and help them with their 8th grade math homework. No, it's because we have an 8th grader who's historically struggled in math, and we run a math assessment on them and find that they have not mastered fundamental math skills to fluency that go back to 2nd grade. And we go back and we produce fluency in those fundamental math skills. And when you do that, all of a sudden they're actually able to generatively perform much more complex math operations with very little instruction, because all of the fluent fundamentals are in place, and they're accessible for that learner for doing more complex things. So that is what we do at Fit Learning. We produce fluency and fundamental skills that produces generative outcomes on more complex skills, and dramatically increases attention span and dramatically improves long-term memory. So that's in a nutshell what we do at Fit.
As you were talking, I was thinking about, as adults, and I've done a lot of trainings, and there's certain things I've learned from people over the years, mentors of mine that have worked really well. And one of them I know knows how to teach really well and how people learn, because he's applying these things in the adult space and running drills,
right?
For salespeople,
Totally.
right? Run a drill. I remember I did that once with objection handling, and I took this team, and 30 minutes, I was on Zoom with them. They were on the other side of the country. And in 30 minutes, I was able to give them some things to work with. And I just said to them, take 10 minutes before you get on the phone to make your calls, and just run a drill. And I gave them the specific exercise. And they did that. And then the manager or whatever reached out to me a couple of days later and said, oh my gosh, their results have gone through the roof. I think they had like 2,000% increase in 7 days. Little drill, 10 minutes, because of that, like exactly what you're talking about. It's that repetition.
Yeah.
Now, you also mentioned about phonetics, and I didn't know this because I don't have kids. I didn't know that they went away from this, because in my school, when I was growing up, I learned phonetics, and we did spelling bees and all that kind of stuff. But when it was a number of years ago, somebody said, well, they're talking about bringing back phonetics. And I thought, I can't believe they actually went away from that. Bring it back. What do you mean? Where'd it go? So it is mind-boggling, the little things that can make a huge impact. And so I'm so grateful that you're doing that, and the impact that you're having. So I know there's so much here that we could talk about. And, I wish we had like 3 more hours to go into this. You do have your book, so we can recommend that people read your book, Blindspots. And that is on all the major, retailers and bookstores and so forth. And it's also on your website. And so that's one, but give them some ideas. Like what can parents and teachers, they're listening to this and they're like, oh my gosh, there's a problem. I've experienced it in my own house or in my own classroom, and I want to do something about it. Number one, buy the book. What are some other things that they can do to get started?
So I'll start with kind of the knowledge side of it. So, inform yourself, because unfortunately, and this is something I spend time talking about in my book, the way teacher training has evolved in the United States. I mean, I guess I don't even know if I want to call it an evolution. The way it goes in the United States is a tragedy for teachers, because teachers are basically exposed to a bunch of theories about how learning happens, and a bunch of options about how to teach things. And then it's basically up to them to go into their classroom and figure out what they want to do. And I offer everyone to reflect on how this would look if this is how engineering went, or if this is how medicine went. So imagine if an engineer, is given some theories about how bridges work, and given some different, introduced to some different ways that people have built bridges before. And then they're basically told to go forth and build a bridge. Would you drive across that bridge that they built? I mean, I'll tell you right now, I would not. And, imagine an engineer not trained in physics, or imagine a medical doctor not trained in biology and chemistry. that is massively problematic, but teachers are not trained in the science of learning, which is a tragedy. So the more you can educate yourselves as teachers about this science, the better. So I highly recommend my book. I wrote it for the public, so it's not. It is translated. It's translated in a way so that people can understand. Because I'm not saying that our science isn't complex. It is, but I have written this book in a way I do think that lay audiences could get benefit from. So it's on my website, drkimberlyberens.com. You'll find links to the book. I also recommend reading another book called Peak, P-E-A-K, from the New Science of Expertise. And this was written by one of my heroes, Anders Ericsson, who we sadly lost about a year ago. But he devoted his life to understanding expert performers from a scientific perspective. And this is a brilliant book because it indicates the essential nature of training and the production of expert performers. And it's also just a really fun book to read. It's really well written. It's really fun. It's, again, written for the public. That's a fantastic book. I also recommend checking out the National Institute for Direct Instruction. That is an organization that puts on trainings, and this is really getting around how to design your classes in a way that evokes, because remember, if I can say anything, is that learning occurs and only occurs through the repeated reinforcement of behavior over time. And that is a law. So we know this now, neuroscience, behavioral science, and those two fields, we know this as a fundamental law of human learning. So when you're teaching your classes, that is what you should always be thinking of, is like, I have to get these kids behaving and I have to reinforce this behavior. And one way to get kids behaving actively in your classes all the time is using direct instruction when you're teaching your lessons. So rather than lecturing and having one kid raise their hand and having one kid answer, give the entire class the opportunity to answer and do it at a rapid pace so that kids are practicing responding to your instruction actively all the time. And then you can give feedback on those responses. So direct instruction is amazing. I recommend looking up Anita Archer, who is the most brilliant direct instruction. She's the most brilliant educator, in my opinion, in the world. She has a ton of YouTube videos on the importance of explicit direct instruction and how to do it in your classrooms as a way to increase those practice opportunities and start getting fluency going in the classroom. So she's the most amazing person to watch. So watching some Anita Archer videos, I highly recommend. And also using things like Quizlet. So Quizlet is a really amazing, and most teachers already know this, but that's a tool for developing your own flashcards, so your own content. It's like a digital flashcard program. But I can't emphasize enough the importance of kids practicing fundamental skills. And when you're sending home a homework assignment, and let's say you're sending home, like you introduced a math concept in class, and then they have to go home and do a homework assignment on this math concept. More often than not, that child is going to engage in really sloppy practice and not be able to do it well. So I would start rethinking what homework means to you and design really good practice opportunities for kids to do at home with materials like on Quizlet. And then you can actually have kids tracking their own rates, which is so fun. So you give them a data sheet and like they start a timer and they're practicing, let's say, math facts for 1 minute, and then they're writing down their scores. And you can also do these kind of group timed practices in the classroom. So building in practice, so like lots of practice. And when you can, measure practice as rate. So as count correct per minute or count incorrect per minute. You should measure both of those to get an understanding of that fluency dimension, because that is the key to mastery. Not just looking at percent correct or giving a kid a check mark on a sheet. Like that's not going to let you know how masterful they are. And so building some of these things into your instruction is really important. But check out, drkimberlyberens.com, check out fitlearning.com. I have to say we are an invaluable resource for teachers because teachers have so much to do. They are required to follow the timeline set by a district. More often than not, they don't have time to help kids go back and master their fundamentals. That's what we do. And we do it fast and we do it profoundly well. So if you need to, you have kids who are falling on their face, maybe before you refer them for neuropsych eval, refer them to a place that can actually go in and fix those fundamental skills. And that kid will most likely avoid a classification, especially if you catch them in the early primary grades. So those are just some of my suggestions there.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yes.
And we'll make sure that links to all of those resources are in the show notes. And there's one
Great.
more that I know your publicist had mentioned about documentary, that you are going to be
Yes.
featured in a documentary that's coming out in the fall called The Truth About Reading. And
Yes.
so we'll have a link, that link as well in the show notes so that they can
Yes.
learn more about it there. So Kimberly, thank you so much
My
for what you're
pleasure. I had a
doing and
great
just,
time.
yeah, and just being able to share this and give us a little taste. And I know that you've been
Yes.
doing this for a long time, just a little taste of what's possible, the problem, but
Yes.
also what's possible and the hope. I think this will hopefully, that
Yeah.
this will give hope to parents and teachers. And if somebody has actually been labeled themselves, that they
Yep.
realize that, you know what, maybe that label isn't accurate. Maybe I don't
Yep.
need to be identified by that label anymore. Even as
Right.
an adult, maybe I can go and,
Yep.
go through and do some training here where I
Yep.
can actually improve those 46, I think you said 46 million people that are illiterate.
43 million. Yep.
43
43
million in
million
this
American
country.
adults.
Wow.
Yeah. I
Wow.
mean, what
That's a
I try to do with
huge percentage.
huge.
It's
And
just
what
crazy.
I try to do with kids who come in and been classified, I try to kind of use humor. So I will say, I'm a golfer, and I should use air quotes. I try to be a golfer, but let's say I had never
You
had any
need more
golf.
repetition.
If I had never had any golf instruction, I never had any golf coaching, and I never practiced, and I went out and I couldn't play golf, does that make me have dysgolfia? Right. And so, like I say to kids, like if you've never had the opportunity to master the skills involved in reading, that doesn't mean you have a disability. That means you need the opportunity to practice and master those skills. Just, look, am I necessarily going to become Tiger Woods? No, but can I show dramatic improvement in my golf skills if I get coaching and I practice? Yes, I have. When I started, I couldn't play, and now I shoot in the low 90s. So I've improved a lot. But it didn't mean I had dysgolfia when I first started trying to play golf. It meant I hadn't practiced and I hadn't had any instruction. So it's like like stepping back from this and thinking about it in that way, and almost like seeing the humor and how kind of ridiculous it is. Like, if you haven't had a good at reading instruction, no wonder you can't read well. And it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It means there's actually something wrong with the way you were taught to read. And let's
Yeah.
fix that. Yeah.
It reminds me of a story many years ago. A very successful businessman. He had his son was being assessed by the class or by the school, and he had actually gone to the same school when he was young.
Okay.
So he's talking to the principal, and they're discussing the scores and the issues, ADHD, all of that diagnosis. And the principal turns to him and says, "Well, how do you handle it?" And he said, "What do you mean?" And he says, "Well, you've been diagnosed with that when you were young."
Right.
He had
Right.
never heard that because his parents had been advised that, and they said, "Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. We're never telling. Yep.
We're not going to tell him that." And they just said, "You're great. You're brilliant. You're going to learn
Yep.
this." And he did, and he became very successful, and he had no idea that this was a label, and so it never limited him. And
Right.
so very, very powerful. Again, Kimberly, thank
Yeah.
you so much for being here.
My
And
pleasure. Thanks
yeah,
for having me.
it was eye-opening and encouraging. And
Good.
I always say that leaders of transformation take action. So,
Right.
information on its own, we've been talking about that here today, information on its own won't
Yep.
get you very far. It's
Yep.
interesting, it's a nice tidbit for a party that you go to, but if you really want to make a difference in your own life and in the lives of your young people, kids, even in your own life, then you got to take action. That
Yep.
transformation requires action. And so I encourage you to take advantage of these resources. If this has piqued your interest, if you have an issue with it, or you know someone who does, dive into these resources, learn and immerse yourself, and then practice and use it so that you can actually get the results that you're looking for. I highly encourage you that. We'd love to hear your stories. You can go on leadersoftransformation.com and reach out to us there. Of course, on all the social media platforms, you can comment, reach out to us, message us there. We'd love to hear how this is impacting you. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in if you're listening or watching. And we look forward to seeing you next week for another episode of Leaders of Transformation.